I think the central exchange, that's been a big debate for the Hex PulseChain ecosystem for a long, long time. So many of us are pro all the facets of decentralization that we talk about, that we have kind of that visceral reaction to a centralized exchange listing. And I see a bunch of mixed opinions on both sides. So I just thought we kind of work through some of the pros and cons. Like we want adoption, right? Like you got to go where the people are. So of course we can all agree on the downsides of central exchanges. We know what they are, right? Like they're imperfect solutions, right? We just saw it with Hotbit, tons of failures. Again, we all know the problems, right? But it doesn't mean that there's not some solutions there. So we don't want people to just sit and hold funds on exchanges, but we do want exposure. We do want the audience. And it does give us options to move people sort of down the road of decentralization. So if you're talking to a no coiner and they say, hey, I've got some Bitcoin on Cash App. Well, that's better than just holding dollars. Like at least they have a taste of the ecosystem. They're able to, watch price charts move up and down, see some of the euphoria. Maybe they just, again, maybe it's just conversations they have about crypto and freedom and all this cool stuff that we talk about. It's important, right? So we do have to meet people where they are, right? Like we see this with all the onboarding. So, if you have a no coiner, like, do we send them to Gamma, one of our just absolute super savvy, crypto just geniuses, right? Well, no, man, like give them someone that's a little more raw, that's going to meet them on their level, right? And I think that that's what we need to see with the central exchanges. Like it's just an option. It's fungibility. It's an audience. It's adoption. We should be excited about those things, right? Now, this does not mean that we forget and we just start using central exchanges and you load up everything and leave it on OKX or you leave it on Coinbase. That's not the idea here. But it's an extra on-ramp. It's extra utility. It's extra optionality for more and more players to come into the ecosystem. And they cannot hear the gospel unless they're in church. Like you have to give people options and ways to get in. So I think that when we see this, we just have to see this as a huge positive. Like, of course, there's going to be issues in the future. If we're on, a dozen exchanges, one of them is going to have a problem in the future. We all know that. That's the reality of the situation. And people should always take great care and minimize their exposure to central exchanges or any of these centralized entities, right? Like we know this game, right? Like that's what brought so many of us to crypto. So be careful. Like take your time. Like, yes, they're going to have problems. Yes, you're going to end up having to do something goofy at some point. Yes, people are going to have problems. Like that is going to come with the territory. But if we're looking at this just objectively, it's plus EV. It's adoption for the chain. And even people who don't use exchanges feel more comfortable knowing things are on exchanges. Like people will just ask, well, what all exchanges is it on? They probably only use one exchange, maybe two, right? That the majority of us that have to use them in any capacity will use one or two, most likely, but they'll still ask what all they're on. Because it's a significance, right? It's like market cap and these other narratives, right? So do we want to educate and try to make sure that people are using hardware wallets and being as safe and using as much, true DeFi as possible? Of course, that never changes, but we still have to meet people where they are. There's just segments of the market that are never going to be as advanced, as involved as we are. And we got to give those people options too. So if the choice is no crypto, I'd rather you had some crypto. If the choice is crypto on Robinhood or Cash App, I'd rather have you on an exchange. If the choice is an exchange or in your wallet, well, then I want you on your wallet. Of course, like we want to keep moving people down that road, but it's not everybody has the same exposure. Some people just have a different view, right? Like there are some people that are going to feel more comfortable with the counterparty. Do I agree? Absolutely not. But the same way that me holding custody of my funds makes it my choice and my responsibility, they're choosing to give that responsibility up. So again, it's not something I agree with, but that is still an option people have. And we want to make sure that, again, everybody has an option to interact with these things as they choose. So I think it's an ongoing debate. I think that, as always, our community wants to be very aggressive and have a very high threshold for what it is we choose to engage with. But there's a balancing act here when it comes to making sure that something like PulseChain is well adopted and well used. Some of the issues with people trying to get Pulse, again, through the bridge and the wrapping contracts, there's some little things there here and there. Again, central exchanges smooth some of that stuff out for people. And if it's easier for them to just on-ramp through an exchange and they're able to directly use Pulse, guys, there's utility in that, right? So it is an imperfect solution. Of course, there's going to be problems, but it's hard not to view these things as just net positive. We've, in different capacities, talked about gatekeeping in a very broad sense around Hex for a long time. We have less of those problems with PulseChain, clearly. Like I've had conversations with a lot of these different entities, both exchanges and just different kind of infrastructure, service providers, different players in the space. PulseChain was always easier to talk with them than Hex. And PulseChain, now that it's live, is way easier than it was to talk about beforehand when it was just something the rest of the community believed. Now that the stuff is live, we're going to have a lot of these conversations. So I do want to encourage people to keep being hyper vigilant and aggressive, but make sure that we're also sort of being forgiving. We do need to be a bit of a balancing act there. So if you have routes to go, if you don't need to use exchanges, don't obviously go move your stuff to an exchange, but understand not everybody's in that place, and we got to have options, right? The more people that see the ticker, the more people that hear the voices that come into the community, the more change, the more impact we can have on the world.